Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Jehan Chu, and I'm the managing partner of Kinetic Capital. And Kinetic Capital is a Hong Kong-based blockchain platform. We started off as a venture capital fund, investing in early stage equity, startups, seed stage, and Series A. And we moved on to investing in cryptocurrencies, in a long-only venture style, as well as investing in tokens in a hedge fund, multi-strategy hedge fund style. And we are also launching 2 tracker funds, so investing in single currency Bitcoin and ETH in an ETF style. In addition, we have a technology arm where we provide blockchain solutions, smart contracts, and audits. And then finally, we have an advisory where we work specifically with token sales and ICOs and startups to help them to launch their own token sales. So I want to ask a quick question of the audience first. How many of you are in a startup now? That's it. All right, and how many of you are thinking of doing your own ICO or your own token sale? That's it? To the mind. Okay, so at Kinetic, I have to say that we probably see maybe 10 to 15 pitches a day. We are kind of oversubscribed with the number of people who are trying to approach us and asking for our kind of help or at least advice to execute token sales. And we've been able to see a lot and establish some type of pattern recognition. And over time, we've developed some types of ideas about how we think ideal or best case ICOs should be handled. But when we think about kind of ICOs themselves, it's still quite a new funding mechanism. We're mostly kind of used to venture capital in its style. And as we've seen the kind of evolution of ICOs, we find that there are some things that work and some things that don't work. In particular, venture capital tends to be very slow money, whereas ICOs can be very fast money. So we started talking more and more about this, and what I want to present today is really some ideas. This is not a solution, this is more just a discussion about what types of alternative funding models to a straight ICO or a straight equity venture capital model could work. Because as I think, for those of you, I think there's more startups out there than I thought. But as you're going through this funding process, I think it's good to see that we are no longer bound by simple VC, and we're no longer bound by just ICOs. We can create new models that are effective not only in the short term, but in the medium and long term, so that your companies have the greatest chance for success, as well as the greatest chance to attract large audiences. So, just a quick note about myself, my background. I actually founded the Ethereum community in Hong Kong back in March of 2014. I was very fortunate to see Vitalik's kind of presentation online. I was very impressed by himself and also this of Ethereum. I also started the Bitcoin Association with a number of people in Hong Kong. The Bitcoin Association of Hong Kong, we have about 3,000 members, and the Ethereum community in Hong Kong now has about 1,500 members and growing. Finally, I also founded a Hyperledger community because I'm also interested to look across chains and across solutions. I think that our world will be a multi-chain, multi-solution world, and I'm very interested in learning about all of the different solutions out there. I'm also co-chair of the FinTech Association of Hong Kong's blockchain community, and so I work somewhat closely with some of the non-governmental organizations to try and educate the public as well as educate the government. So, what are the basic issues in startup funding? I think that if you were to try and boil it down, some of the basic issues are really access to funding. That's really the biggest problem. A lot of people that are startups, especially first-time startups, really are at a disadvantage because they don't know where the money actually is. And they spend a lot of time just educating themselves to try and figure out what is the correct way to go about pitching for money. Are you supposed to just put a pitch deck together, go to Silicon Valley and knock on doors? Absolutely not. There's definitely a community and almost an elite, unfortunately, elite community of venture capital firms, as well as personalities, as well as relationships, which if you don't even know that they exist, you're already locked out and you're already at a disadvantage. On the other hand, if you do know that these communities exist and these relationships exist, you can try to take advantage of them. But it's a very, you're really at a disadvantage as a first-time startup. So that's why sometimes as a VC, one of the questions we ask the startups is, how many startups have you gone through? How many times have you tried to raise money? And it's a simple kind of benefit. The more times you've tried to raise money, the more relationships you've built. And the more relationships you build, the greater the chance that you actually have relationships in place that can lead to successful funding. Second, cost of funding. How much does it cost you to actually go out there and raise money? So raising money actually is quite expensive in itself. And everything from getting your legal documents together, to travel, to fly across the world to Silicon Valley or to New York or to London or wherever you're going to go, as well as everything else that you're still trying to do just to build your base application, which will help you kind of raise that money. Third, the timing of the funding itself. Once you close all these deals, for example, let's say you're trying to raise like a $2 million seed round for your startup, and you get someone who says, yes, I will fund you for $200,000. Actually, you don't get that $200,000 for a number of months until you close out your round. And actually, even though someone is going to bet on you, you can't actually take advantage of that money, of that funding, of that support until much further down the line. So the deployment, the use of those funds on both sides, from the investor as well as from the startup, is actually very slow and very inefficient. Fourth, the quality of the funding. Smart money versus dumb money. And maybe you've heard this term before. Smart money is money that comes from quote-unquote experienced investors, and dumb money is money that comes from the crowd or perhaps inexperienced angels. And the quality of the money is quite important because there's a multiplier effect, there's a network effect that comes from smart money, and perhaps one less so which comes from quote-unquote dumb money. Of course, there's pros and cons to them all. There's no right way to do it, but I do think that when you're thinking about who to raise money from, although you might have a friend who's an angel, who's willing to put some money into you, you have to remember that all of the slots that you're fundraising for come with an opportunity cost. Every dollar you take from one person is a dollar that you cannot take from someone else, because you have a limited capacity to take money. So you want the quality of your money to be very good, and you want what's called strategic investment from people that can not only add dollar value, but network value, validation value, potentially business partnerships value, as well as the different types of connections. And I would almost say, as a startup, when you're thinking about raising money, what you should really be measuring on is not just how much cash you raise, but how many relationships come along with the cash from the person that's giving it to you. Try to measure that value, not in dollars, but in connections. And that's especially important when you're thinking about the blockchain world and the token world, because actually this is why ICOs are so great, because the network effect and the multiplier that you get from so many people participating is much greater. And then finally, the longevity of the funding. So for example, we'll go into this, but it's quite difficult in ICOs. You do your ICO, you have your money, let's say you're successful, you got $20 million, but then what? It costs a lot of money to continue developing. Maybe $20 million will get you 4 or 5 years of runway. That's great. But in reality, it probably goes down as time goes on, and actually that $20 million won't last 5 years. You'll find that maybe it'll actually only raise you 2 or 3 years, last you 2 or 3 years at your planned 5. So then what do you do? How do you get more money? You're not finished, you're not at the final kind of version of your application. What can you do next? You've already sold all your tokens, the tokens are already circulating, and perhaps you don't have enough money to continue going. You're basically dead. If you don't achieve network effect in the ICO model, in the window that you have, there's no other option. So ICOs have still not solved for this idea of eventual and further funding, whereas venture capital, you have multiple rounds and it's staged. So you have angel round, seed round, series A, B, C, D, E, F, all the way to IPO. It's very staged and it's very predictable. So let's talk about the traditional venture capital process. When you're thinking about the kind of pros of it, again, you have kind of multiple stages of funding. There's actually some decent benefits to the venture capital process. It's not perfect, but there's things that are good about it. One thing that's good, that it's a familiar, mature ecosystem and process. And what that simply means is that there are a lot of VCs out there. When you say venture capital, when you say VC, people know what that is. It's immediately recognizable. You don't have to explain it to most people, and it's a familiar process that if you're a VC or if you're a startup, you can immediately jump into. There are existing communities, there are existing resources, there are banks, there are a whole professional infrastructure of literally hundreds and thousands, if not millions of people who are there to support this process. Second, it is a regulated and predictable industry, which is good. Regulated because there's no legal uncertainty as there is in ICOs, and predictable, whereas you know exactly what happens at each stage. You don't have to try and figure it out each time. Finally, there's a relatively low risk for execution of a venture capital round versus an ICO. Obviously, with an ICO, unfortunately, we've seen many examples where the ICO or the project team at various stages has been hacked, and all of that hard work that they've done, and all of the support that's gone into it is suddenly gone. With the VC process, there's no way to run off with shares, there's no way to run off with the equity, and so it's quite a low-risk proposition. Unfortunately, the venture capital process is quite slow. It can take 3 to 18 months to complete a funding round, and in that time, if you don't have enough money and capital and support, your startup could die while you're still raising money. Second, there's a very poor return on revenue for the time spent in the angel and seed round. So for example, a lot of angel and seed rounds can be anywhere from $100,000 to $1 million. But if it takes you 6 to 12 months to raise that $1 million, that's actually a really, really poor return on the time spent. You're better off doing something else, actually. Finally, it's very resource intensive and it requires travel and time, as well as just the energy of constantly going around and kind of doing the VC dance. But let's talk about the ICO process. What does a typical traditional ICO process look like? Well, first you need to kind of ready your structures, right? You need to decide from a legal perspective, where is my ICO going to be? Am I going to be in Zug? Am I going to be in Singapore? Am I going to be in the US via the Cayman Islands? What types of tax implications will I have when I'm launching that token sale? How should I think about the revenue from an ICO? Am I going to be taxed on that? Is it even legal? Second, you have to get your legal opinions together, so you need to be able to get access to some of the legal firms around the world who will provide you with the legal cover or the legal right, in a way, of defense to actually issue that token sale. And then finally, any governance structures which come along with that. So for example, if you're doing a foundation model, as Ethereum did, or as some of the other, I've seen a number of ICOs to take that approach, you need to get that ready too. Second, you need to get your materials ready. Your business plan, your white paper, your technical paper, your pitch deck, as well as, hopefully you have some code on GitHub, as well as some type of beta version of the software before all this is ready. That's ideal scenario. Then you need to go out and do community building. You need to spend a lot of time in order to attract people to your Slack channel, to your Telegram channel, to your WeChat channel. You need to spend time to continue to engage and continue to create content, to answer questions, to constantly feed your audience and keep them interested in what you're doing, all the way from the start, all the way down to the actual token sale. And what a lot of us actually haven't experienced is that even after the ICO, you still need to keep managing your community, you still need to keep developing, you still need to keep engaging. Fourth, you need to do your pre-sale book building process, and that's basically a relatively somewhat controversial process where you actually go out and you try to sell some of your tokens in advance to people like me, which is an investment fund or a token fund. And the advantage of selling to people like us is that we will take a risk before your ICO and give you money and investment that you can use in order to get to your ICO. Now, a typical ICO can cost anywhere from $100,000 US to $750,000 US or more, based on legal costs. I think Perkins Coie in the US now charges over $400,000 US just for the basic token sale package, legal documents for one jurisdiction only in the US. It can be very expensive. So if you don't have that $400,000, you're kind of dead in the water. On the other hand, the bad thing about going to people like us is that in some cases, it's not necessarily seen as favorable by the community because the big whales are taking some of the big positions, and when we come in, we typically come in at a discount to the ICO. And there's a lot of fear out there that the whales or the funds will dump their tokens on that token sale day. Typically, that's not always the case. We try to have ourselves locked up so that we don't actually get our tokens on day one, we get them over time later, so that there's no fear of this kind of dumping. And then finally, you to exit your ICO and then try and find your exchange listings. There's a lot of good things about the ICO process. It's a low barrier to entry. From a cost standpoint, it can be low. It doesn't have to, you don't need to use Perkins Coie. Ideally, a lot of these, the cost of regulation, the cost of legal things will go down. From a technology standpoint, a lot of this, there are great smart contracts out there that are proven to be stable and secure so far. It's very accessible. Anybody can run a token sale if you want. And the idea of the token sale is already familiar because we already know kind of things like Kickstarter and what crowdfunding is. Second, the economic incentives of ICO format really kind of helps to kickstart a network effect. The process of getting people interested and getting people invested in your sale really creates users out of it. And it aligns the interests of these investors and the users, because actually your token holders are the customers. The unfortunate parts about ICO process is that there's a really unclear regulatory framework so far. We've started to see a bit of development in places like Tokyo, where they've started to open up a bit. Hong Kong is still an unregulated market where there's no negative regulation on ICOs yet. Singapore is also open. But then, of course, there are places, other jurisdictions where they have been banned and where there is a bit more restriction. Second, token sales and ICOs tend to come from, crowds of 1,000, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 people. And just the odds are that most of these investors and most of these people participating are not sophisticated investors. They're not accredited, and they might be participating in an angel funding or an ICO for their first time. And that means they don't have the same kind of experience and pattern recognition in order to see the difference between a good ICO or a good project and a bad one. And it takes time to kind of spend through that process. Also, inexperienced investors can influence perception. So suddenly you're invested in this ICO and you start telling other people, they start telling other people, and then unfortunately that can lead to a hype factor, which really has nothing to do with the actual underlying fundamentals of the company. Is it good technology? Is it a good team? Do they have a good business model? Can they execute? All these things can be difficult. And then finally, it may not align interests over time if there's too much attention on the price of the token rather than the actual development of the project. So what I wanted to kind of just bring up as an idea are some of the alternatives, perhaps, or maybe evolutions as middle stages to post-ICO or post-pure ICO. The first one is a token equity hybrid, where you're raising both tokens and equity. And there's two versions here. One is an ICO seed round, and the second is a SAFT-E round. And we'll go into this. Second is a continuous token issuance, and then finally is a crowd micro VC. So the first example is a hybrid SAFT-E round. And SAFT-E rounds have actually been around for a little while. A SAFT-E stands for SAFTE, Simple Agreement for Tokens, Future Tokens and Equity. And what that means is, as an equity investor, I can sign an equity agreement and I get debt in the company before the token sale. And then when the token sale happens, my equity or my debt in the company converts into tokens. So for example, let's say that I sign a note and I'm giving $1 million to a project and I sign a SAFT-E. That $1 million is not equity in the company. It becomes $1 million worth of tokens after the token sale is completed. So this is a good way for some people to participate. And this is actually, if I'm not mistaken, pioneered by a guy named Jack DeRose from Colony.io. And this is open source. It's an open source document. You can find it online and you can use it as you like. So what's nice about this SAFT-E round is that it provides sophisticated investors the ability to invest in a format that they're familiar with and that they can have the mandate to do so. So one of the things to understand here is if you're an ICO, you're trying to get VCs, traditional VCs, interested in your round, you have to understand most VCs cannot buy tokens. The money that they raise from their limited partners who gave them the money to invest does not allow them to buy tokens in many cases. And so that's a big limitation. There's not as much money out there as you think, because many VCs can't actually buy tokens. They're not allowed to. They would literally be violating their constitution and potentially be open to legal suits or lawsuits if they bought tokens. But doing a SAFT-E is debt or equity where they actually do have the ability to participate. So if you do a SAFT-E, you can still do your token sale, but you're actually able to then raise from traditional parties. Second, it really aligns their interests across the investment mediums. Equity holders are aligned with the token holders in the long term, so you don't have different qualities or different classes of quote-unquote investors or shareholders, because actually everybody becomes a token holder over time. The problem with this is that it still doesn't allow for further funding of the startup. Once that SAFT-E has run, the token sale is done, then there's no other rounds that can be done in the future, because it eventually leads to a token model. Next is the ICO seed round, and this is the one that I think is maybe the most interesting to think about. There's in some places people are talking about the end of venture capital or the end of VC because ICOs are taking over. But I don't think that's really the case. I think that ICOs will potentially disrupt just one stage of the investment process, and I think that it's the seed stage. I think ICOs are perfect for early stage, really just kind of the first funding, where you're getting a crowd of people interested in your sale, and you're kind of rallying them to participate on themselves. So the way that this works is that instead of doing a $20, $50, $100 million ICO, do a $5 million ICO, do a $2 million ICO, do a tiny one, and fill it, and use that kind of round to get people interested and to get people using and aware of what you're building. It's really not meant to fund you for a very long time. It's actually just meant to bootstrap you. It's meant to use the crowd and all of its quote-unquote dumb money, but it's very, very strong enthusiasm to support you and also to kind of buoy you a bit. So I think that an early angel round or a seed round or an ICO makes a lot of sense, where you get your tokens out there. And then later on, you can do your kind of equity funding, where you go back to traditional VCs who will support you in the long term and provide the type of guidance and network and partnerships. Part of the problem with ICOs is that for all of you that have ever participated in an ICO, how often do you go to the project that you funded and tell them that you want to help, and tell them that you want to connect them to someone else? Probably not often. I know I don't do it that much, because I'm just supporting maybe a little bit and I'm buying the token. But with venture capital, one of the advantages is that they are aligned with you long term and trying to support you going forward. Next, I think that it's good because it provides you with enough runway to kind of get up and running and prove your model to more sophisticated money. Third, it segments the benefits of both types of investors. It does what each type of investor does best in terms of early stage funding and then later stage funding. And also you have to remember that in later stages, you have the equity to give away because you haven't given away so much in the early stage. When you do if you do a $2 million ICO, you can reasonably say that you're perhaps a $10 million valuation company, and when you're raising in those first equity rounds, you're already raising at a higher valuation, so you can give away less equity for more money and get you more runway down the line. So it actually works out in a way which is good. In addition, for later stage VCs, all we want to see is traction. It's this magic word, traction. How much traction do you have? How many customers do you have? How many sales do you have? And if you want to get good quality VC money, then it's good to have that. And having done maybe 6 months or a year of ICO kind of development bootstrapped is not a bad thing. Finally, it allows the value of the company to be effectively split between the network value of the token, but also the equity holders. So one of the challenges, for me, for example, I invested in something called F-Corp, which is now called Parrot. So I was an angel investor in Parrot, and I got shares for that. So this was before they were doing Polkadot. This was 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago. But when they said that they were doing Polkadot, it was really unclear to me. What am I getting as an equity holder? How am I participating? And so that's still an issue that hasn't really been sorted out. But I think that if you have a hybrid model, it's one way to kind of start clarifying that kind of conflict or perhaps challenge. And then finally, I just want to kind of go over this idea of a micro crowd VC. And really, this is just an idea where people are participating in the ICO. So everybody participates, but you get further benefits for locking up your tokens longer. So for example, in an ICO, you're typically not locked up, which means as soon as the ICO closes, you can trade those coins. But I think there's value in having less liquidity and value in having the token holder be aligned for the longer term, which means that you participate in the ICO, but you lock up your tokens for maybe 6 months, maybe a year and a half, maybe 2 years. And you align yourself just like a VC would, and you commit yourself to helping the company grow. I think that if you try to align those incentives at the user level rather than at the company level or the fund level, there can be some really strong network effects and strong kind of benefits to that type of approach. And then finally, and very lastly, there's this idea of kind of continuous token issuance, where instead of selling all of your tokens at once, you actually don't sell them all at once, and you sell them over a very, very long period of time. So instead of having this kind of rush and creating this moment to fund and buy all the tokens, actually you just sell them at a measured pace and allow yourself to have a more steady and more sustainable token sale over a month, over 12 months, over 2 years, maybe 3 years, and you're selling a bit at a time, and constantly proving your value back to the community. So I think there's a lot of levers out there. I think that there's a lot of issues to be solved. And obviously ICOs are here to stay. They provide a really strong benefit in many ways. But I think in the longer term they provide a lot of challenges where they cannot be the only solution in their current format. On the other hand, we've learned a lot from the VC world, and I think that although the VC world has a lot of its own challenges and venture capital generally seems to be quite broken, I think that ICOs lend a lot of life to VCs, and I think what we're going to see is this convergence of the two, and the professionalism and the experience of experienced VCs and the enthusiasm and the kind of participation of the crowd will come together into a more hybrid and a more kind of naturally kind of organic type of partnership. So that's it. Just a few thoughts for you to think about as you're out there in the world with your startups or as potential kind of ICO participants, just to think about and see how we can help each other a bit more. Thank you very much.